Freedom of the press isn't just important to democracy, it is democracy.
We're here to hold elected leaders accountable.
I want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We're going to see you back here next time. Until then, hi, I'm Jane Whitney. Thanks for joining us for the season premiere of the Conversations on the Green podcast. It may feel like a lifetime, but it's only been months since the deadly coronavirus turned our world upside down and forced us to make changes in our lives we never dreamed possible. To help us explore whether a global pandemic that's caused so much pain and suffering could actually serve as a bridge to a better future, 3 distinguished guests joined us on May 17th for our first live virtual town hall. CNN presidential historian and best-selling author Doug Brinkley, bioethicist and former advisor to the Obama administration Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, and 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Nick Kristof. Here's our conversation. We're going to be talking about how you see life after COVID-19. But first I want to start with where we are, and I want to start with you, Zeke. From the get-go of this pandemic, we were really never given a straight story about how dangerous it was. There was a lot of magical thinking involved. In other words, we didn't always get the science and the facts. Now, at this point, President Trump is saying that we've met the moment and we've prevailed. On the other hand, epidemiologist from Yale, Greg Gonsalves, says that right now we're in the throes of genocide by default. Two pretty big extremes. Can you give us a sense of what the science says about where we are right now?
Those are pretty big extremes, and we are in the early stages of this pandemic, and I think you said it does feel like a lifetime in the United States since we've sort of taken action. It's been 10 weeks, and if you want to push back, it's been 4 months since it's been on the shores here in the United States. We have about 86,000 plus deaths, and millions of people are infected. Exactly how many, we don't know for sure. And it's going to persist longer. We haven't turned the corner. It may be going down. It's a little hard to say, because if you take the American numbers and you extract New York, where it is going down, it's probably still rising in the country. But it may flatten out over the summer because of the combination of weather and being outdoors, which makes transmission harder. But almost every epidemiologist is predicting a recurrence in the fall when we move inside and the weather gets more fortuitous for viral transmission. And that's, I think, going to be a problem. We are going to see a second wave. That's inevitable, almost inevitable. It could disappear, but that's very, very unlikely. It doesn't look like it's behaving like SARS. And so we're going to have another resurgence and an increase of death, which is, I think, very problematic. We don't know how many resurgences we're going to have. The flu pandemic of 1918, 1919, and 1920 had 4 very distinct peaks. The second peak was the largest, and the second to largest was actually the 4th peak. So we're probably in for another long haul, and until we get a vaccine, we're going to, be under this cloud. And it is a cloud. It's up. I mean, one of the things which I think people find hard is it's very unpredictable. We know that it focuses on elderly people with comorbidities, but clearly people who have no comorbidities, are not elderly, are susceptible to serious complications and even death.
Okay, let me ask you, I'm going to use the figure 60 days. We're 60 days into this. And so far, with the exception of the states and some of the local governments who have been the real heroes of this whole thing, there's no plan, there's no framework, there's no strategy. And we sort of feel, at this point, Estonia and Serbia do more testing per capita, it's my understanding, than we do in this country. So that whole gap of time when we could have been, the lockdown could have given us time to sort of build a plan. Am I missing something? Is there a plan?
No, I think you're 100% right. The president did release a plan last month. It was not very detailed, but it did have, I like to say, a couple of advantages. It made it clear that this is going to be stepped, that there are phases. It's not going to happen. Reopening is not going to happen all at once. And second of all, that different industries, different places that we are going to open at different rates because of the risk of transmission. But a larger game plan of how to test, how to contact trace, how to institute these public health measures and make sure they become the norm, like wearing face masks out in public, that isn't present. And I think probably the most damning, if you will, lack of a plan is the fact that the CDC has not issued detailed guidance, and what has been issued has been quite thin, and it's leaving it to every individual business, every individual industry, school, organization to develop their own detailed plan about how they need to open up. And so you have now a proliferation of plans at the state level, at the individual company level, rather than a baseline coming from the CDC so everyone could know what a minimum standard is and if they want to go over it. I have to say that it has to be one of the most disappointing, and I'm sure for the internal people working at CDC, one of the most disheartening parts of this. I think the president at one point said that he's a cheerleader. And what we really need is a leader who's going to recognize the difficulty of this task, prepare the country, but walk the talk. And this president has clearly refused to do that. You don't have to look any further than his refusal to wear a mask out in public.
Right. Okay. Well, as you may know, this is a virtual town hall series. And so, of course, we've had to regroup like everybody else. And we've taken questions when people registered and people sent them in on videos. And the number one question, Zeke, and this will not surprise you, is people want to know when some semblance of their previous life is going to return. And what's the short answer to that?
Well, it depends what they mean by some semblance. So normalcy, as we experience it in 2019, is going to require a vaccine, and a vaccine that 80% of the American population gets. That will get us herd immunity. When exactly that happens is unclear. The predictions that we had this past week by the president that is going to happen before the end of the year, I think most people are quite skeptical of that. Probably in 2021, we could have a vaccine, but that won't be distributed to enough people until we get towards Q4, the fourth quarter of 2021 at the earliest. So that's when you're going to see normalcy. Nonetheless, there are, the summer does afford us this advantage of being outdoors, warmer weather, and some understanding of who's at risk. And I think we will get back to some normalcy with that. That doesn't mean you're going to be eating in restaurants. It doesn't mean you're going to be going to your religious services and singing. It doesn't mean you're going to go to baseball games and scream and get your concessions. But, so we're going to have to reconceptualize what some semblance of normalcy is. And I do think, normalcy in terms of shaking hands, in terms of not wearing a mask and those things. No, we're not going to have that for a couple of more years. Normalcy in terms of being able to go out and picnic, being able to potentially go to stores. I think that is going to slowly return.
Okay. I'm going to ask you this point blank. If we had had a plan, do you have any estimate of how many lives could have been saved?
We could have done much better than we've done. I think Nick Kristof has early on published a very wonderful graphs working with the Toronto group about how, a week earlier, having earlier lockdown, having testing, being able to contact trace better. Tens of thousands is the answer, maybe as many as half of the number. And I think the best place to look at it is Taiwan. Taiwan prepared for this. SARS scared the living daylights out of them, and they prepared heavily for this. And they've had, I think, 500 cases and less than 10 deaths. So it could have made a big difference. if the president had taken it seriously in January, had issued a national stay-at-home policy, and encouraged all the governors to follow suit, done more, gotten the testing right between the CDC, the FDA, and commercial labs, I think, probably 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people is what we're talking about as of today.
I just want that number to sink in with people. It's a lot of people. I'm going to turn to Doug at this point. Doug, we hear that this is a world historical moment. We hear that it's an era-defining moment. We hear that this will define our generation in the same way that World War II defined our parents' generation. How do you see this?
I think that's true. I mean, the world's going to be seen, and at least in America, we're going to be thinking of pre-COVID and post-COVID, and we're all looking forward to a post-COVID world where hopefully we can do things better next time. But, as a historian, my job's always to remind people that our own times aren't uniquely oppressive. And if you just go back in American history, I mean, the whole story of our country is one of plagues and illness and disease that you would think would have derailed our democratic experiment. I mean, during the Revolutionary War, the British actually were starting to use smallpox as an offensive weapon to destroy the Continental Army. And if it wasn't for George Washington inoculating his troops with the smallpox vaccine, and they didn't even know back in the 1770s what germs and viruses were. It was very lucky that we were able to have a smallpox inoculation, and it saved American troops, and it ended up maybe creating our country. No inoculation for smallpox, there may not have been a United States. And you just look at turning points and see how disease has ravaged us. I mean, the Spanish-American War, you had about 3 out of every 5 soldiers who died were from typhoid fever and other diseases. And World War I, having to do with the Spanish flu and what influenza did. What's the point of all that? That's to try to be hopeful that we've gone through perilous times, and it usually arouses our scientific community and doctors. In World War I, when Woodrow Wilson got the Spanish flu while he was in Paris and his daughter was infected and his personal assistant did, Wilson almost died from it. But yet we kind of forget about it today, up until people reading John Barry's book recently, where it's become a bestseller. People had sort of forgot about the Spanish flu epidemic in many ways because life moves forward. So I think now is an opportunity to start thinking about the post-COVID world. And it was in World War II that we were able to start using antibiotics for the first time to stop tetanus and mumps and control influenza and do new kinds of things with sanitation. So there's an opportunity now for us to reconfigure ourselves for the middle part of the 21st century with new medical miracles that everybody around the world is racing to concoct right now.
So potentially, in a good way, this could be a real paradigm shift as you see it. Let me just talk about World War II, because you mentioned it for a second. They really showed, the Brits showed that when you're together on something, when you're united and have a shared purpose, you do better. Now, we're living in a country that in many ways is very, very divided. So I was very surprised to see that the latest poll shows that 82% of Americans feel that we're more united than we are divided. Does that surprise you, Doug? I mean, does that mean that we're going to do a better job of weathering this storm?
Well, when you look at, there's no question we're in a neo-civil war between the Republicans and Democrats. It's unfortunate that this pandemic hit during the 2020 election cycle. Politics is playing too big of a job in it. But I'm here in Austin, and I have 3 kids, 2 in high school, 1 in middle school, and I don't know if their parents are for Trump or Biden. When I go down the street and I see people with masks, I'm just seeing a community that's by and large following the protocol. And maybe the undersold story here is how many Americans were willing to try to stay inside, try to wear masks, try to social distance. And that's Democrats and Republicans. Are there jerks and yahoos that are creating conspiracy theories and confusing people and are sitting right now and ignoring social distancing at bars or beaches? Absolutely, that exists. But the core of America is kind of pulled together. Nobody's asking whether the doctors or nurses are Democrats or Republicans when they're working our hospitals right now. And in World War II, nobody really cared when you were put on transport ships or you were going into battle how you voted. So there is a way to look at this as kind of uniting the country. But on the other hand, we are divided, so we'll have to see how this all plays out. I would call a united America one that emerges from this saying we've got to do better on public health, deal with climate change, start putting scientists at the forefront of American life and not putting them in a bottom rung. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy was president, scientists were picked by Time magazine as the persons of the year. This year, we would say the persons of the year are our doctors and nurses, medical experts. And we got to build on that. We got to really take public health seriously. We spent all this money on the DOD and missiles, and we're going to have a new nuclear showdown, billions, trillions of dollars spent, but we have neglected our public health responsibility, and we were caught largely, almost completely off guard for COVID-19.
Let me just ask you one more question then, because systematically for 40 years there's been a war on how government is seen, that government can't be a force for good, that there has been a war on science and experts are seen as elitist very often, and a war on facts. Now, Doug, based on what you just said, it sounds like you have some hope that you're seeing people come home to the science, to the facts, to the fact that government can actually be a force for good. Are you actually seeing that shift?
I think whatever Donald Trump is, I mean, he has a lot of blarney. He's a kind of a salesman, a carny figure in many ways, and he entertains people, and a lot of people have stayed with Trump and are continuing to stay with him. However, when you're sick, when your grandmother is sick, when your daughter is sick, you're not interested in the blarney and the used car salesmanship. You're not interested in right-wing blogs. You're interested in healing and trying to heal individuals that have been attacked with COVID-19 and save lives. And so I think this woke people up in some ways because everybody's being affected by it, that we're going to have to care more about prenatal care and how do we deal with issues of obesity and diabetics, and also how do we keep our stockpile going for this type of pandemic again. When Bill Clinton was president in the 1990s, he read Richard Preston's novel science thriller, The Hot Zone, and also one called The Cobra Effect. And he called Preston to the White House, and Bill Clinton pulled together people on pandemics and started recognizing this could be one of the biggest threats ever. And we started building these warehouses all over the country with surgical gowns and masks and antibiotics and things, ventilators. That was the 90s. But since then, they got antiquated and nobody cared anymore. And nobody being polled the last election. Where do you put public health on the list of your most important worries? It wasn't even on the list. So we've got to wake up to we're doing destruction on the planet, that climate change is real. We've got to listen to scientists, and we can be more prepared for future pandemics or biological attack because we failed at this time. The Trump administration, in my view, lost 2 months of dragging before they kindly woke up to what was really happening.
Nick, in the last couple of weeks, you've written two jarring columns. First of all, about how the death count has been severely undercounted. You at this point feel that we're well past 100,000 American lives lost, and you presented compelling data for that. You've also written about how you think that the virus is really winning at this point. Now, we do see the confirmed cases are declining. Do you still see the virus as winning? Tell us why.
I think we've made some progress since I wrote The Virus is Winning. Now I'd say we're fighting it out. But I do think that there's a gulf between a lot of the public perceptions and that of epidemiologists in a couple of ways. One is that there are a lot of armchair epidemiologists out on Twitter who are absolutely confident about what's going to happen down the road. And the real experts, they say we really don't know. And we still don't fully understand the patterns in 1918 about why, some localities suffered as much as they did and others didn't. And in some cities, famously Philadelphia screwed up the policy, and St. Louis did a terrific job. But there are still a lot of the patterns in 1918 that we don't understand. And we don't understand in this year why some countries have been spared, even though, like Cambodia, even though they did nothing right. So, I think there's a lot of humility among experts about how to gauge the tide of battle that is not found among the public. And I think likewise, there's a sense among many people in the public and in our political leadership that this is a short period we need to get through. And then we come out on the other side and then we're okay. And in fact, and Zeke alluded to it earlier, that there is a lot of, I think epidemiologists think that it's hard to predict and we don't know exactly what the pattern of waves will be, but that this is going to be a problem for probably the next year and a half that we're going to face and that we're going to lose a lot of lives in. And I don't think that has fully sunk into the public consciousness. So having emphasized how much humility the experts have, I'm going to be wary of, assessing the state of battle right now. I must say, it was encouraging to see Georgia open up and more than 2 weeks later to still have new infections not be, bursting into the skies. Today, there were reports that hospitalizations are up, but, there's some sense that there are some ways to manage this if we do it right.
The one thing I think we've learned is how much we don't really know. As you said, it's been a humbling experience. But I also want to ask you about what President Obama said yesterday during a commencement address, which was that this virus has really shaken up the status quo and it's exposed all sorts of inequities and unequal suffering, systemic racism. When you were awarded your second Pulitzer Prize, which was for covering genocide in Darfur, you were called a voice for the voiceless. So I want to ask you, when you hear people say we're all in this together, what goes through your head?
Well, we say all the time how the virus is an equal opportunity killer, and of course it isn't, because society is not an equal opportunity society. So you have African Americans who are, depending on the study, 2.5 or 3 times as likely to die from it as whites. And this comes on top of a profoundly unequal social and economic and health structure, one in which the top 1% has a life expectancy at birth that is 20 years longer than that of the bottom 20%. And so far, COVID has magnified those inequities around the country. I think it's very hard to gauge where this goes down the road. The 2008-2009 economic crisis magnified the opportunity gaps in this country, and we moved on from there, and they continued to be exacerbated. That may happen this time. COVID it's not only is going to exacerbate the gaps in this country, it's impoverishing the poor in a way that is not impoverishing the rich. 40% of people in households earning less than $40,000 a year have lost their jobs. On the other hand, if you're at the top end of the socioeconomic spectrum, that is less likely. Likewise, internationally, there is going to be a pandemic of hunger and illiteracy that is going to follow the COVID pandemic. But there's also hope, because, as you say, this does expose long-standing inequities in this country, and at times of chronic disease, then the elites are not necessarily threatened by some people who don't have access to health care. In times of infectious disease, we are all only as safe as everyone else is safe. And so it may be that there will now be some pressure to increase access to health care, to increase paid sick leave, and that we will begin to address some of these inequities that virtually every other advanced country already has addressed.
You went to two New York City hospitals on location, and you captured the humanity and the heartbreak in I think it was 6.5 minute long piece. And we were lucky enough to talk to the New York Times and to be able to get that footage, some of that footage, to share with our viewers right now. So let's take a look at life and death in the hot zone.
While intubated, patients can't speak, and what everybody knows is that they probably will never speak again. Ventilators may be life-saving, but most patients still die. Death here has no dignity. Patients can't have visitors. They're scared. They can't even see their nurse's eyes. I've reported on lots of deaths in my career, and this feels particularly brutal.
Someone codes, someone dies, you go on to the next patient. Someone codes, someone dies, you go on to the next patient. And you don't have time to process those emotions until you get home. I have cried just at home thinking about it all. Just when you get home, you finally take a breather, and that's when you let it all out. Because you don't have time to process those emotions here.
These doctors and nurses are risking their lives, and we're failing them. Some told me of their deep frustration with the government's response. We catastrophically bungled testing. The president dithered. Americans kept on partying. The result? Thousands of needless deaths.
I was in the intensive care unit. The second patient who came in who was tested positive was a 27-year-old. I'm 29 right now. I'm just as healthy as this patient. It just oftentimes feels like a roll of the dice.
I spent 12 hours by his bedside with all my PPE on. He would grab my hand and I just kept telling him that everything is going to be okay, that we were doing the best we could. But I could see the fear in his eyes, and it was heartbreaking because this is still so new to us, that we're just doing what we can and we don't know what's going to happen.
As I see it, the triumph here lies in the courage and humanity of the health workers. This may not be enough to defeat the virus, but it's magnificent to witness.
I've watched it a dozen times, and it's just so powerful. You have seen, by your own admission, death. You've witnessed atrocities. Can you characterize how going into those hospitals was a unique experience for you?
Most of the time that I've spent in hospitals in my career has been in hospitals in poor countries. And here you go into a New York hospital and it has every possible bit of diagnostic equipment, ventilators. I mean, it has unbelievable equipment. And yet that equipment isn't working terribly well. And we don't really know very well how to save these lives. And so what struck me was that even though our technology for now was not working so successfully, the humanity of those health workers, and what struck me the most maybe was the way they were holding hands of patients and trying to reassure them. And it's this ancient primeval gesture, but it worked. And it, in the face of this viral challenge that is preying on our human relationships, it was a way of asserting our humanity. And I think that was the thing that moved me the most from my hospital visits, that desperate effort to assert humanity and reassure people who were desperately afraid.
I just want to ask something. Listening to you, you seem like clearly you're a humanitarian, but you seem like such a sort of even-keeled kind of person. And yet, given the things you've seen, do you ever get angry?
Yeah. When you see, so I think a lot of people think that I must be kind of the Eeyore of journalists, this incredibly gloomy, mournful person because I cover genocide and sex trafficking and war. But in fact, over the course of my journalistic lifetime, I've seen immense progress. And just since the year 2000, The number of children dying before the age of 5 has dropped in half. I've seen millions of lives saved. Leprosy used to be so much more common. Diarrhea used to kill so many more people. So many more people going blind from trachoma, from river blindness, et cetera, et cetera. But if that is inspiring, it's also infuriating when you see that we have tools to address problems at home or abroad, and then we leave that toolbox in the corner and don't use it. And it feels to me that that's what happened this time, that, if the state of Kerala in India can manage COVID-19 with its very few resources, then why can't we? The New York Times had its first article about PPE shortages in January, and yet policymakers didn't respond and try to assure those supplies to those heroes out there in the hospitals. And I think we also bungled not only the health response, but also the economic response. And yes, that is infuriating. And when I pound away at my columns, that's driving me forward sometimes.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll have more conversation with our guests when we return, and questions from our virtual audience too. Stay with us. Thanks for listening to the Conversations on the Green podcast. This virtual conversation was taped on May 17th. Our panelists are CNN presidential historian and best-selling author Doug Brinkley, bioethicist and former advisor to the Obama administration, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, and two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Nick Kristof.
As I mentioned earlier, we've had a lot of questions come in for the three of you today, and I think we're going to take the first question on video right now.
Hi, I'm Hannah from Connecticut. The New York Times has reported that while the New York metropolitan area has seen a clear reduction in their infection curve, the rest of the nation is in fact seeing an increase. Governor Cuomo has enacted one of the strongest responses, saying repeatedly that every life is priceless. He's also seeing a greater reduction in infection. So how would you characterize the actions of other state and local leaders when it comes to the determination of economic health versus public health?
And at this point, I'm going to turn to Zeke, because Zeke, I know that you worked on a plan for the Center for American Progress. You are working with our Governor Ned Lamont right here in Connecticut on a reopening plan. How do you strike that balance that Hannah's asking about?
Well, it is the case that a number of governors across the country have done a remarkably good job moving from west to east. You might say Jay Inslee and Governor Newsom have done a great job. I mean, Seattle and Washington have really, they jumped on it. They entrusted their scientists. They had a consistent communication package. They closed schools, asked their companies to bring workers home, and it has done a remarkable job. They were never overwhelmed. You move further east, you get people like Pritzker in Illinois and Whitmer in Michigan. You get Mike DeWine, a Republican, in Ohio. You get Larry Hogan in Maryland, another Republican. So there has been a sort of bipartisan, some governors have really gone out there, and then other governors you're sort of baffled by their response. Governor Kemp in Georgia saying he didn't know that asymptomatic people could spread this illness, letting Mardi Gras happen, despite the notion that crowds and passage when people couldn't physically distance was a serious problem. So it has been a very uneven response across the country. And by and large, when places do shelter in place, have wearing masks, hand washing, workers go home, you can respond. I mean, New York is a very good example. Where you don't, where people think that, it's not going to happen here, or we can continue with our regular activities, we have seen an increase. Now, that may be muted over the next few months because of weather, because the public itself has not waited for governors and the president to lead and tell them. I mean, all the data that has been published has shown that people actually curtailed their physical, they're going out they're frequenting restaurants and things several weeks before official announcement. So the public itself is hesitant and is putting that hesitancy into action. It's important to reinforce that behavior and not to undercut it by saying, we're ready to open, let's liberate Michigan or Minnesota or what have you. And so I think, a major part, going to a question you asked before, is the inconsistency of the message and therefore the confusion of the public. And I think a lot of people don't know what the right thing to do is, given that. And that may have repercussions over the next little bit.
The interesting thing is that you look at the polls right now and you see that big majorities of people, they don't want to go back to restaurants, they don't want to go back to bars, or malls. You can open these places. The question is whether people are going to have the confidence to actually go into them. And I think it's interesting that it's, again, cutting across party lines. This is not a blue or red kind of issue.
If you talk to a lot of economists about this, they will consistently say, given the data, that the best therapy here economically is public health, because you have to convince people. Initially it's a demand problem, which is people aren't going to shop if they think going to shop exposes them to getting COVID-19 and potentially dying, and they will sit back. That gets reinforced, and unfortunately, people lose income because of the unemployment, and therefore you'll get a typical, they can't spend problem. So often, even if you open, quote unquote, open up or allow stores to open, the amount of economic activity is going to be low because the demand side is hesitant. That's why to convince people that it's safe is going to be important to the revival of the economy. Every economist says that and believes that. And so that's the critical element for actually not just opening stores, but actually having robust economic activity.
Doug, I was going to ask you about the controversy that former Governor Chris Christie kicked up when he talked about the fact that it was our patriotic duty to get the economy going again, and basically that we tolerated a lot of death in World War II, and it's just part of the price you pay so that we can keep the way of life that we all want to have. What do you say to that?
I thought Governor Christie was very callous when he said that. And I also think the big problem here is that our country's been rudderless without presidential leadership. Donald Trump has every day switched what he's saying. He's done mixed messaging. His whole goal now is to scapegoat Democratic governors. He's already using the pandemic for political purposes. It seems to me that the guidelines of the White House should have been that our country stays largely shut till June. Instead, he first said President Trump Easter, and then it was late April, and then he started doing weird tweets, liberation tweets, when the right-wing people were protesting in Wisconsin, and so that we have no presidential leadership. So all of this now is up to individual governors, but not just governors, mayors, and county officials. For example, where I'm at here in Texas, people in Austin really don't want things open right now. They really like a lot more of a lockdown for a while longer. We're not sure whether we want to go back into stores. But the state's Governor Abbott's made a ruling, and so cities like Austin and more progressive cities don't like what the state's doing. So I think in the end, it's just going to have to be individual communities have to decide what's best. And if you live a place that you don't feel comfortable with the way our politicians are operating, then stay home the best you can. But in the end, we got to open up. We just can't completely shut down, and it's all about a question of timing. I don't know anybody who doesn't want the economy going before, and Nicholas Kristof so well was talking about the economic disparity with all of this. It's one thing for me as a university professor, and I'm not ready to go back, but if I have no money and I'm poor and I'm broke and I'm trying to raise 3 people, there's going to be more of an incentive to get back to work immediately. And so in the end, a lot of this is a story of 2 Americas, the Americans that can survive this economically, and then an underclass that's really having a difficult time, and it's only going to continue to be difficult because we are in a depression-like situation. And just like there are going to be 4 waves of COVID-19. We're going to have economic downturns popping for the next couple of years too. But in the end, America will prevail. We will get beyond this. It's just a question of when. The vaccine's a big game changer, but just also over time. And at least now our country's more prepared for the lockdown drill, a stay at home and wear a mask. And I think we're educating young people and a new generation of Americans that this may be, we may always be having to be in a pandemic, quasi-pandemic mode, or at least be prepared and not be caught completely off guard like we were this time.
Okay. Nick, let me ask you about a column you wrote, which had the provocative title, "McDonald's Workers in Denmark Pity Us." Because the premise of that piece was that Denmark sometimes is the butt of jokes. And your point was that when it comes down to how they've handled this, they've done a really good job, and we would do well to perhaps heed some of the lessons they've learned. What do you think about the way Denmark has handled their reopening?
So, and Ezekiel alluded to this a little bit earlier, there's sometimes perceived in the U.S. to be a trade-off between getting the economy open and keeping people safe. But fundamentally, the way to preserve the economy is to also keep the virus at bay. And you see that in Denmark, and it responded very early. It did an enormous amount of testing. And so as a result, the deaths per capita, so testing per capita has been more than twice what it has been in the U.S., and deaths per capita have been about half as much as in the U.S. And so as a result, it has been in a better position to open up the economy. And first it opened up childcare facilities. Then later it's been opening up other parts of the economy, including the retail sector. But that is based on doing a good job fighting the pandemic itself. And in this country, there's been a lot of talk about the Swedish model, because Sweden didn't impose a formal, official, economy-wide shutdown. But at the end of the day, Sweden's economy seems that it will have more of an economic contraction this year than Denmark's, and it will also lose about 3 times as many people per capita. And so, it's a reminder of the need to focus on the public health side, and that in turn will protect the economy. But the reason that McDonald's workers in Denmark pity us is, look, they have an economic model that is focused on jobs and jobs that pay well. And so their economic response was don't just let everybody be laid off and then pay them unemployment, as happened in this country, so that we now have a real effective unemployment rate of probably more than 20%, but rather pay employers to keep people in the jobs. And so the last official unemployment rate in Denmark was just over 4%. In June, it's expected to rise to just over 5%, but nothing like what we have in other countries. And meanwhile, Denmark has achieved that by spending a smaller share of GDP on the economic response than the U.S. has. And those McDonald's workers in Denmark, the starting pay is $22 an hour with 6 weeks of paid leave. And somehow the burgers are only 19 cents more than those in the U.S. I mean, there is a business model that does allow one to confer dignity on workers and a reasonable wage in ways that also preserve a certain amount of the social structure and the social fabric.
We have another question standing by, but I have to ask you this, Nick, because it's so obvious that the countries that did better in handling this pandemic are headed by women. And we just talked about Denmark. They have a female prime minister. Of course, Angela Merkel, Iceland, New Zealand, they crushed it. Jacinda, she just knocked it right out. So I have to ask you, what do you think is the secret sauce there? Why do women do better with this sort of thing?
And Taiwan, I should mention too, is another female-headed place that has done exceptionally well. So it's interesting, and I mean, I'd say that the N is still pretty small. I'd be a little reluctant to generalize too much about this, but there has historically been a sense that women are good at public health matters in particular, and there was a quite good study done at Stanford that showed that when states in the U.S. Provided women's suffrage at the state level, then as a result, state governments then invested more in public health and sanitation in that state because that was perceived to be an issue that women voters cared about. And as a result, they saved a large number of lives in public health. This is the late 19th century, early beginning of the 20th century. And likewise, there was a quite good study in India where village chiefs were randomly assigned to be female at times. And some MIT scholars took advantage of that randomization, and they found that those villages that, for perfectly random reasons, had a female village chief had better access to water, for example. So, there may be something to the idea that public health concerns, that making society work, that protecting the family are issues that resonate more to women voters and to women leaders.
Okay. Thank you for that. At this point, I think we have a question. Yes, is that Zeke?
Yeah. So one of the things that I notice, and I don't have a study on this, but we often joke that men drivers never ask for direction. This is certainly pre the GPS, and women drivers do ask for directions. And I actually think there's something to that also in terms of women leadership, in terms of recognizing expertise and asking experts for the advice, and men sort of barreling ahead like they got it. And I do think what characterizes this pandemic and response to this pandemic is using the science that we know, albeit imperfect. And I think Nick has said this pretty clearly. Look, if there's anything this thing is uncertainty, embodied. We don't know how it exactly kills. We don't know whether it affects pregnancy. I mean, there's so many things we don't know. But I do think that recognizing that there is some expertise in epidemiology, there's some expertise in public health responses that we can draw on. I think there's a tendency of women to be willing to defer to expertise a bit more. And we saw this in American history during the progressive era and stuff. And so I think that combined with that, women are very invested in children, in public health, and in making sure that the next generation is really provided for. I think those things do help explain why there may be this woman factor in terms of responding to the COVID pandemic.
Oh, there's a factor there. I'm sure of that. At this point, we have a student in Ohio who's standing by with a question that I'm sure a lot of folks want to know the answers to.
Hi, my name's Amanda, and I just finished up my junior year at Ohio State. This question is for Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. Ohio State is continuing its virtual classes for the summer term, and we're waiting to learn what will happen in the fall. What benchmarks should colleges and other schools consider when determining whether to resume regular classes in the fall and open on-campus housing? What precautions should we as students take if normal classes resume? And how do you see college life changing in the future because of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Zeke, she addressed that to you.
Yes, I got it. So I've been heavily involved in questions about universities reopening in the fall. Some universities have clearly made a commitment not to reopen and to stay online. You've seen this in the Cal State system in California. Harvard Medical School has put the fall online. Other universities and colleges are clearly trying to decide and trying to see how things are going to play out. So first of all, let's talk about there are many factors that are involved. One is, can you physically distance and handle classroom with that? It's hard to have very large classes. I myself teach a class of about 150 students. Very hard that we don't have an auditorium that can probably handle that at the University of Pennsylvania. How are you going to handle that? That means that even if you come back in person, you're still going to have some students that are going to have to do online and probably flip the students from auditorium. One day is, A through M, and the next day it's going to be N through Z. So I think we're never going to get to a situation where even if we open up campus, you're going to have fully in-person classes during the fall. You may have, you're almost invariably going to have a hybrid. Second or third, there are lots of classes that can't be done via Zoom, architectural studios, clinical encounters for nursing and medical students. And so I think those are going to have to be done in person, and we're going to have to institute a lot of safeguards and protocols around that. Housing is also a problem. Can you provide singles? Can you have a place where you can create pods so only a certain number of students intersect with each other, so you don't increase the number of people you intersect with, and therefore the chance for major super spreading if some student gets sick. And that's focusing on the students. Then you've got faculty and staff, and there the problem is that they're not young invincibles. And, part of that problem is, for you students who are, say, under 25, the risks are relatively low. They're not zero, but they're relatively low. But for faculty and staff who are older, who have comorbidities, much higher. And many of them may choose not to teach in class and to teach online. So if I were to make a prediction, university is going to try to avoid and see what happens over the next 6 to 8 weeks. You're going to have some hybrid, and what that ratio of hybrid teaching in the fall is going to be, how much is in person, how much is online, I think is really the decision to be determined. And let me just add one more complication here, and that complication is the problem of a potential second wave, second surge in call it November, October or November, and then you'd have to disperse again. I will say one last word. All universities and colleges that I know of are thinking that the Friday before Thanksgiving week, that's the last day of class. So they're going to truncate the, even if they are on campus, they're going to truncate the on-campus segment. Finals and study and all that will be done remotely.
Okay. Doug, down in Austin, I think you have 3 children, Cassidy, Benton, and Johnny, right?
Correct.
And what's going on with their schooling?
Well, first off, I graduated from the Ohio State University, so congratulations to the person who called in from Ohio.
Nice.
It's a great school. Look, there's not one size fits all here for education in the United States. So let me just tell you, at my university at Rice, I give these dramatic lectures where I pace around with American history and use the blackboard. I can't do that this year. I'm going to have to sit just like I'm sitting now, because the option's going to be to the students whether they want to attend class with the mask and social distancing and larger spaces than normal. But if you don't feel comfortable, if you feel you have a pre-existing condition or you're a student who's worried about it, you can do it online. So that's that hybrid approach that Zeke was talking about. All of these midterm breaks in October are being blown out. People are going to be running it from late August till about Thanksgiving, and that's going to be the semester. It's in the economic interest of these universities to open, but some schools don't create campus life. I mean, yes, the California State University system is going all online, but they've never been marketing themselves as the college experience like a William and Mary would or Princeton would. And so, it's lots going to depend on regions, but all dorms you're going to have to get temperature tested before you walk in. If there's suddenly an outbreak that occurs in a dormitory or in a classroom, it might be back to all online again. So it's going to be this mixed approach. For my kids, 3 of them, thanks for asking, in high school, it's pretty much the same thing. They all made it through this semester online. But the idea, the hope is in late August that you can have school, but before you line up and you get temperature tested before you come in. And they may have a week where a student in high school, to divide the class in half in schools, you might be able to do one group stays at home one week, one group's in the class the other week. What nobody's really said properly is, what about older teachers? I'm going to be 60. I have asthma. I've had it all my life. What's my risk for teaching? And that is going to be really social distancing a lot. And also there may be people that put up a plastic front like you're seeing at a 7-Eleven or a drugstore right now, to try to find ways to minimize exposure if, God forbid, that it starts hitting campuses in the fall, which it will hit some schools. It's not going to hit all. Some schools will have to close. Some schools will stay open. It's going to be a mixed bag.
As you said, one size can't fit all at this point. Okay,
Can I add something
Nick?
about? Yeah.
Sure.
To me, the big concern is not so much higher education, partly because there are some ways to do remote learning for higher education. And the big problem is both pre-K and K through 12, especially for disadvantaged kids. You know, middle-class kids, upper-middle-class kids, their parents will make sure that they have books, that they're getting class lessons, this kind of thing. But the bottom third or so of the distribution, if they miss a significant amount of school, that is going to have a long-term, a lifelong impact. Already 1 in 6 American kids doesn't graduate from high school. Those kids are cooked. And if they miss more school, it's going to increase the risk that we have, a cohort that is functionally illiterate, that is functionally not numerate. Every summer, the bottom third or so of the distribution returns to school having lost a huge amount of information over the summer, while the high SES kids have actually risen over the summer in terms of exam performance. And, in terms of remote learning, there are 7 million American school kids who don't have internet at home. How are they supposed to learn? I do hope that one thing that comes out of this is indeed a commitment for bandwidth for all. My hometown in rural Oregon was transformed by rural electrification. And the analog to rural electrification and the way that brought opportunity to so many rural towns across America is bandwidth for all. And when schools are closed, that underscores how much we need that.
Yeah, good point.
Okay.
Can I say?
We have another question right now. Yeah, go ahead. Is that Zeke? Go ahead.
So, yeah, sorry, the delay is making it hard. So I think Nick is 100% right. And, young kid, Denmark started with, I think, grades 1 through 4. Norway started with grades 1 through 4. I think we need to focus on those children. I'm actually an advocate for summer camps, summer day camps, because I think you can have them outdoors. You can ensure or minimize risks. You can have exercise and nutrition and maybe some learning over the summer. And that allows their parents to begin working too. Remember, part of school is it allows parents to actually be free so that they can work if their businesses are going back to work, and even if they're working at home, to concentrate better. So I do think on the younger grades, as Nick said, we probably have to get it open, and the risks to kids are relatively small. It's the risk to adults that have to be managed. Nothing in life is risk-free, but I think this is one of those areas where we really do probably have to bite the bullet and assume those risks as a society, going in and allowing parents and teachers to opt out.
Okay, we've covered the spectrum there. I want to go right now to a question from a young man in New York City.
Hi, I'm Atoje from New York. This question is for all the panelists. With the regulations on social distancing and wearing masks, how do you feel about people getting harassed and bullied for not wearing masks?
All right, there have been this whole thing about wearing masks and how people get very hostile. They get hostile both ways, but there have also been a number of incidents, including somebody in Flint, Michigan, a security guard in a store who was shot and killed because tried to enforce this mask policy. So people see it, Nick, as you know, as their rights are being infringed on. And how do you deal with this? Because people, as I say, this is getting more and more intense. What would you tell somebody who doesn't want to wear a mask?
I'd say that it's not that you're making a choice about whether or not to infect or to take a risk for yourself. You're taking a risk to other people who are around you, who may be immune compromised, who may be at much greater risk. And that one of the obligations of any citizen in a civilized society is to respect some limitations as part of the benefits of that society. And it's comparable to vaccinating one's kids to help achieve some herd immunity or to help protect other kids who perhaps can't get vaccinations. And I mean, that's going to be another level down the road that we're going to have to face when some people refuse vaccinations. And I just find it unbelievably sad that right now we are in a situation where people assert their political values by refusing to wear a mask. There's something of an analogy in 2009 during the H1N1 flu. The first polling showed the Democrats and Republicans were approximately equally concerned about H1N1, which makes sense. It's a virus. Why should our attitudes toward it depend on politics? But then, because Fox News, because Rush Limbaugh said that, oh, this is just an Obama hoax, I'm not going to get vaccinated, then Republicans ended up saying that they were only half as likely to get vaccinated against H1N1 as Democrats were to say that. And it appeared, based on vaccination rates and mortality around the country, that people lost their lives as a result of their political assertions and refusing to be vaccinated for it.
Okay. Anybody else, Zeke or Doug, want to weigh in on the mask situation?
Well, I think that word harassed. I mean, no police. Should be harassing people. But what happens in this YouTube age is somebody gets a video and it goes viral and it gets played over and over and over again. I've been impressed by my fellow citizens. I think most Americans are trying to do the right thing right now. And we don't have this massive amount of civil disobedience and uproar. Yes, I can drive right now by some place where they're not social distancing at an outside bar here, but most places I go, I'm really impressed at how respectful millions of Americans have been through that. I think our government has failed us, but I think the American people, by and large, are rising to the occasion. But it's the jerks that get a lot of the attention because they're breaking the norms and not social distancing or wearing a mask. And then all of these nonprofit groups that are making masks and people trying to communicate through Zoom in different forms, all of these philanthropic groups that are thrown themselves into trying to confront this, the work of corporations that have gotten behind it. I find there's a lot functioning well in the United States. We just got trapped out of this horrific response by Trump and unpreparedness for an infectious disease like COVID.
Zeke?
Yeah, I think, behavioral psychology tells us that, if you attack people for doing something, they're going to become defensive and feel like they have to dig in more. What we really need to do is to establish wearing a mask, physical distancing, and these things as the norm, and that if you're deviating, because people don't like to be out of the social norm. If you go to lots of places, whether it's Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, 90%, 99% of people wear masks. You would feel out of place if you didn't wear a mask. That's a kind of attitude we need to create in the United States. And we need the leadership to create that. We need celebrities to get out there. That has to become the norm. And then people will adhere.
It's a process. Okay, we're going to take one more question in this block, and then we're going to go to life beyond COVID situations. Right now we have Steph from New York who has a question.
Hi, my name is Stephanie and I'm from New York. This is a question for all of the panelists. How do you foresee Western attitudes around technology and privacy changing in response to COVID-19? A key to successful contact tracing in South Korea and Taiwan has been tracking individuals' movements via their cell phones. But there has been a legal and cultural resistance to this tracking in the US and Europe. Do you expect this dynamic to change in response to the virus?
All right, this is emerging as something that's again controversial, that people don't want to be tracked, they don't want to be traced, they don't want to have, it's an invasion of privacy. What do you think about that, Zeke?
Well, first of all, we already are. It may not be by the government, but you can call it Facebook and Google. They know when you've left your house. They know when you've gone into a particular restaurant. I find it ironic that people are, I don't want to be tracked for public health reasons. Well, for commercial reasons, we are tracked all the time via our phone. So I think actually it is the case that there are some things technology can facilitate in terms of contact tracing. So far, it hasn't been a big success, in part, I think, because the tech companies haven't actually put their back into it because they're afraid precisely that you'll find out how much information they have on you. But I do think we have a population that is hostile, some portion to the government having that information, some portion to the corporations having that information, worried about it being commercialized, worried about it being abused. So we do need some, as the Center for American Progress report we developed, we need a trusted intermediary who can get this data, promise not to commercialize it, promise not to combine it with other data that isn't health related, and be willing to absolutely destroy that information after 45 days when it becomes not helpful for public health reasons. And I think that's what the state we have to get to in the United States. We aren't comfortable with tech companies or with the government doing it. So we, I think, would be willing to give up that information if we trusted the organization that was getting it had only one purpose, and that is to protect our health.
I was going to say, how are you going to find a trusted intermediary? Do you have one? Do you have one?
Yeah.
Well, we propose the Association of State and Territorial Health Officers. We could create one. I do think that's not impossible. I do think that there are trusted people in this country who could serve that role, or trusted organizations that could serve that role.
Okay, because the polls do show that people, they don't want it in the hands of the federal government. They're fine if it's in the hands of a health organization, or they're finer with it. So that's an interesting point. At this point, I want to go to a question that came from Denise Linden, who's in nearby Southbury, Connecticut, and she wants to know the biggest change you see ahead in our lives because of COVID-19. And I'm going to start with Nick on that.
Well, so Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm optimistic that there will be profound change. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, I'm not so convinced. But I do think that just as we came out of the Great Depression and embraced Social Security, that there is an opportunity here to recognize some of the failings of our society, of our institutions, of our health response, of our economic response, and embrace. I mean, I mentioned bandwidth for all a little bit ago. Bandwidth for all would be, a enormously progressive step forward for much of the country. Finally achieving real universal medical coverage and dental too, while we're at it. Universal child care of the kind that is found everywhere else. I think that infectious diseases have underscored some of these risk factors to the whole society in ways that may perhaps create a certain amount of political momentum that make that possible. It's just whether that is actually achieved is going to depend upon us and how we exercise our political rights in the years ahead.
Okay, Doug, let me ask you, because it's been suggested that we shouldn't want to go back to the normal that we have, that we should forge a better new normal. And given that the economy is cratering, given the unemployment stats at this point, it seems almost that we're poised for an FDR moment. Do you see something like a New Deal possibly in the future?
Well, I would certainly hope we could do something like FDR did with the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression, or with John F. Kennedy's Peace Corps and AmeriCorps, which is a medical corps in the United States, where you're getting almost like a National Guard of an infrastructure where in an emergency people could be called to serve. Not just nurses and doctors, but people that get perhaps 2-year training to be able to be a hospital assistant, or people that can go to the Navajo Nation or parts of Appalachia or the worst parts of Detroit and immediately come in as you would with the SWAT team. So we're not caught so unprepared. I think something like that could be approved on a bipartisan way in the United States. But the problem I see coming now is going to be, everything recently has been about urbanization and a young generation wanting to live right in the belly of downtowns of cities. Some people now might be afraid to be downtown. Are skyscrapers cruise ships? Or should we be living out in the suburbia? Or is it going to be more of an abandonment of urban centers for satellite areas, or living more in rural America? I'll be curious to see, but I know a lot of people are getting nervous about being around people. And the idea that in 2 years from now, everybody's going to crowd together back to work and be on subways and going right in New York City like it used to be, I'm not so sure if people want to ride subways anymore. Well, then how do working people get to work in the city? And what does it mean for downtown real estate? And I think we're in for a great redefinition of living. And one of my favorite writers, Wendell Berry, a poet, agrarianist from Kentucky, has written about this for years, and he might be right. I mean, that people need to recognize space, land, having conservation, stewardship in smaller communities may be a more effective way to live than packing people into cities, which are by nature are going to be prone for viral and bacterial problems. Theodore Roosevelt himself suggested that America should be medium-sized cities, that the giant metropolis creates so many problems of public health concern. Well, we thought we got away from all that. We're the 21st century now. But now we see that if you take certain neighborhoods and you can see how COVID's operating in a Detroit or Philadelphia or New York in particular neighborhoods, or Houston in the poor neighborhoods, it creates a skepticism on this idea of packing people together one on top of one another in public housing and urban sort of livingscapes. I'm not saying they get abandoned, they're not, but I think people are going to start thinking about their lives, and you may see states like Idaho and Montana, Colorado grow in population as people start imagining a life with some room to move around them.
Okay. Zeke, what's your big change?
So I would agree with Nick. I think there are two things that I've seen, or I think COVID is going to produce. One is we've got this huge level of uncertainty. We've got the uncertainty that surrounds the virus itself, the healthcare system, and then we have this economic uncertainty that it's created for lots of people. Unemployment, will they be able to pay their rent? Will they actually be able to feed their kids? The long lines at food pantries. I think people are going to respond to that uncertainty and want just the opposite. We want security, and we expect our government to provide a secure safety net. We have had, among Western countries, the most wholly and inadequate safety net. Lots of people fall through. You call someone a contractor, they no longer have benefits, they don't have unemployment, they don't have sick leave, they don't have retirement, they don't have health care. We're going to solve those problems, I believe. I believe there's going to be a huge amount of pressure because it's good for people. You can't any longer as an employer not count those contractors and not contribute to providing them benefits. We're going to have to figure out a different benefit system. I do also think we're going to have to figure out a new universal coverage arrangement, having places like Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida with big COVID situations not have an expanded Medicaid for these newly unemployed, I think is going to become unacceptable. The second change is related to how we raise children. We're realizing all the infrastructure we need to raise healthy children, schools, after-school activities, girls and boys centers. We are appreciating all the work that great teachers do. I think you're going to see a resurgence of interest in that. And again, to pick up on what Nick said, childcare, early childhood interventions, pre-K, universal pre-K, recommitment. We were seeing this before COVID-19 with a lot of the wins by teachers and strikes. I think you're going to see a re-recognition that we have to seriously invest not just in the education, but all the infrastructure around education, the after-school sports, the dance classes, the band, the plays, and all of that stuff. And I do think this sort of thinking about how we can make life better for families could be a real message coming out of this COVID-19.
That would be wonderful. Zeke, while I have you, there have been folks, I think, submitting questions as we've been on air here. And a lot of people want to know about a vaccine. This past week when Dr. Bright testified, Dr. Rick Bright, vaccine expert, he threw some cold water on the whole notion of this timeline that it's 12 to 18 months away. 2 questions. What is your prediction on the vaccine? And Nick raised this in his column. What if there is never a vaccine?
So, look, we've been working on trying to get a vaccine for HIV/AIDS for decades, and we're nowhere close. COVID may be different. I do think the rhetoric coming out of the White House in the last week about we're going to have a vaccine before the end of the year, very unlikely. We have, here's why I'm more optimistic, though. We have 4 kinds of approaches to it. We have 100 or so different companies working on it and different potential vaccine possibilities. And we probably have more brain power working on this problem than on any single biological problem we've had, certainly in the last 40 or 50 years. And I do think we're going to get something. I don't think it's going to happen in the next, call it 8 months before January 1st. I do think 12 to 18 months is a possibility. But I have noted many, many times that everyone who is responsible and says that always has the caveat, and I think Rick Bright put it correctly, if everything goes perfectly. Not everything is going to go perfectly. There will be some problems, but I do think we can hit that level. That doesn't mean all 330 million Americans, much less the 7.5 billion people in the whole earth, are going to get a vaccine by the end of 2021. We're going to have to, we're going to be able to develop it. And we shouldn't stop after we get the first, because the first may not be the best. It may be good, but not great. So I do think we're going to be able to bet on, between 4 and 10 of them and see how they work. We're going to see in the fall when we have this resurgence. That's when we're really going to begin testing them. But remember, you have to test thousands and thousands of people, and that's not done overnight. And so I think it's going to take longer than most people, certainly than the president has announced. And 12 to 18 months is the earliest we're likely to have something that's effective. And that doesn't mean that all of us will get it by 12 or 18 months.
Okay. Did you address what happens if we never get one?
Well, if we never get one, we're going to end up getting to some level of herd immunity with tens of thousands, millions of people really dying from COVID-19. And it's going to take a lot more years of that. That is a very horrific possibility because you'll only be able to get out there and have people feel comfortable when there's a kind of herd immunity that has dampened down the infection rate. And that requires, in the United States, 2 people infected. If we have, call it 15 or 20 million people now, that would be 10 times the level we have now. You can see how many deaths we might get if we have to get there. That's a pretty horrific scenario.
Okay. At this point, I just want to make note that we really are being flooded with questions, and we have some pre-taped questions we're not going to be able to get to. And I apologize for that. I hope you've heard your question answered during this broadcast at some point. But we are, as I see, running out of time, so I'm going to move on at this point. And I'm going to ask that Caroline from Connecticut ask her question.
Hi, my name is Caroline Consolving, and I wanted to ask, what do we have to look forward to? Could you each discuss the silver linings in our future? Thank you.
Who wants to start on the silver linings? We have to leave people with hope. It does seem that the negativity is oppressive and it's a hard thing to live with. So, Nick, what do you think the silver lining is?
If you think of at the broadest level about challenges for this country, beyond COVID, and opportunities to address them, then it does seem to me as if in many ways the U.S. went awry in about the 1970s. And until then, we had the highest high school graduation rates in the world, and we pretty much invented the mass high school attendance. We had incarceration rates that were comparable to those of other countries. Our health rates were similar to those of other OECD countries. Our spending, government spending as a share of GDP was comparable to those of other countries. And in the 50 years since, we systematically took policy decisions that resulted in underinvestment in American human capital, so that we now lag way behind other countries in high school graduation, in functional literacy. Mass incarceration increased sevenfold, which had devastating effects on the American family. We've had deaths of despair at a colossal rate, so that life expectancy fell 3 years in a row in the U.S. in a way that was not true in other countries. And this is very personal to me. I wrote about it in our last book. A quarter of the kids on my old school bus in Yamhill, Oregon, are dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And that was because they didn't have a skill set that would enable them to compete in the job market today in a way that I think if they had grown up in Canada, they might have. And so I think this is a 50-year mistake that the U.S. took. I think that happened in part because of Nixon's Southern strategy and a tendency to demonize investments in social services and in human capital as highly racialized. I think and I hope that there is an opportunity to address that, in part because it is now so obvious that the consequences affect everybody of every complexion, and that you have white people as well as black and brown people who are dying because of lack of access to health care or because they don't get paid sick leave, who aren't able to compete in a global job market because they don't have that high school degree, let alone that college education. And American history, as Arthur Schlesinger noted, it moves in cycles. I've wondered if that 50-year cycle may not be ending. It seemed to me it maybe reached its apex in Kansas a few years ago when Governor Sam Brownback cut taxes so much that Kansas schools were devastated, and Kansas Republicans rose up and rebelled and said, tax us more, we want better schools. Idaho and Utah expanded Medicaid. It's crazy that those other remaining 14 states haven't expanded Medicaid. I think that there is a chance now to correct this, what seems to me a 50-year wrong turn in American history, in ways that will lead to new investments in the next generation of Americans and make America competitive in the world today and strengthen it in ways that will resound for the benefit of this country and our citizens for years and years to come. How's that for optimism?
Okay, so the last question to you, Nick. That's stunning. I want to ask you, though, because you also have 3 children, Nick, and 10 years ago you were interviewed by Mother Jones, and you said you were surprisingly optimistic, and you've said you're optimistic on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We got that part. But with your children, are you optimistic for the world that they're moving into?
I'm guardedly optimistic. At a global level, I'm more clearly optimistic, partly because of investments in education and healthcare. And, in the broad sweep of time, look, until I was a child, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate. 50% literacy was achieved worldwide for adults only in the 1960s. Now we're pushing toward 90% global literacy. That's transformative. The improvements in healthcare because of vaccines, sanitation, et cetera, globally, the decline in fertility, all these things are really changing the globe in ways that I think are profoundly encouraging. Fewer than the share of people, I think every day, the 300,000 people will get access to electricity for the first time. Now, COVID is going to lead to a real step back. There is going to be a hunger pandemic and illiteracy pandemic globally as a consequence of this. I do think that they will be temporary. In the US, I'm guardedly optimistic, but I don't think that, I think whether we seize advantage of these opportunities really is we've come to a fork in the road, and we can continue on the path that we've been on for the last 50 years, where we underinvest in Americans, where we have a safety net that allows many, many people to fall through, where we talk about personal responsibility as being the be-all and end-all, and neglect our social responsibility for helping kids and infants achieve some kind of better outcomes. And we have maybe it's not a function of exactly being optimistic or pessimistic, but we have the tools in this country to produce better outcomes. The question is, can we seize those tools and implement them?
Can we do it? Okay. I'm going to take that as a yes, Nick. Let me just, because we are very close to being out of time, I'm going to have you, Zeke, give your silver lining, and then I'm going to go to Doug. What's your silver lining?
Well, I do think that we're at a inflection point. I would agree with Nick. I do think that we've had it. I think Donald Trump is the obvious logical play out of a strategy that has tried to divide the country rather than unite the country, largely but not exclusively along racial lines. It's also been along lines of academic achievement, coast versus internal. But I think Donald Trump is the embodiment of the end of it, and I think most people are find that its problems have been revealed by COVID, and I think it will deflect us. The question is whether we have the political system that can actually respond and overcome the entrenched interests that resist that kind of reform. And I do think with strong leadership and a change in the Senate, you will see or able to see a change in these kind of policies. The one thing that gives me serious pause is climate change. And it's been very hard for the country to take it seriously, a bit like COVID, low risk event with very enormous impacts. We're not good at responding to those in the United States because it requires a sustained investment. It requires being willing to invest for low risk events and not an acute episode. And I think that is going to be the real test of the country. Can we get a kind of infrastructure bill that allows us to address climate change in a systematic way? And it's going to require serious investment over time. And I'm worried about that. And COVID doesn't directly speak to that, doesn't directly catalyze that element of the change.
Okay. Doug, I'm going to have you wrap this up, and I'm going to change the question slightly by asking you what lesson you want your children to take away from this period in time.
Well, they're going to be part of the COVID-19 generation, the ones that had their graduations truncated, that had to start doing online education, that got to watch a nation in peril and see how our generation, the baby boomers, screwed up so much. But I really want them to have hope to change the world. I'm writing a book right now called Silent Spring Revolution about the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s. And we did do a lot. Young people put their shoulder to the wheel. We did create an environmental protection agency. We forced people like Richard Nixon to do marine protection. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, spurred a generation. So I think this new generation's my silver lining, that they maybe have had it with our mistakes. I see a much greater Earthwatch awareness. When you talk to young people, they are concerned about climate change. I don't know how soon it's going to come, but we are destroying the planet right now. We're poisoning the air and skies. We saw what's happening to the Amazon and Australia and California wildfires and increased cyclonic activity. And this is a game changer, what we're doing to the planet with climate change. It's going to be hard to recover if we don't move quickly. And I'm afraid the hope's going to be with the next generation that could put the climate challenge number one, because it's connected to public health, it's connected to famine, it's connected to pestilence, and everything runs off of the environment. Where this, if anything, COVID-19 taught you, with people being arrested with their upper respiratory systems, unable to breathe, and yet we're pouring pollutants into our atmosphere that are causing people to have heart disease and increased asthma, increased respiratory illnesses. We've got to start taking care of the planet in a new kind of way. That's a big order, but it's going to come through educational change and thinking of a new generation, not every 4 years there's a new election and, magic's occurred because one party's controlling this and one party's controlling that. As we saw, Donald Trump just undid so many executive orders of Barack Obama on the environment. They're gutting America right now. All of our environmental protections, all the way back to Richard Nixon, are being unraveled. So politics can only do so much. It's going to take the heart of a new generation to want to save the planet.
Okay, heart of a new generation, a good place to end on. I don't even have the words to thank our guests for donating their time and their talent today. And as everyone knows, the proceeds from this broadcast go to help the American Nurses Foundation Coronavirus Fund and other charities on the front lines of this pandemic. So we are just enormously grateful to have you all here today. Thank you very much.
Before we break away, I want to thank you for joining us. You'll be able to find the rest of our season wherever you get your podcasts, and our next episode will be released in about 2 weeks. But there's more conversation on tap before then. If you're worried about the safety of your vote or the safety of the upcoming election in November, if you're worried about the rule of law being under siege, have we got a show for you. Our next virtual town hall will record live on May 31st. Joining us will be former U.S. Attorney and NBC analyst Joyce Vance, former Deputy Solicitor General Neil Katyal, and former Department of Justice official Chuck Rosenberg. Learn more and register at conversationsonthegreen.com. The Conversations on the Green podcast is a partnership with Connecticut Public Radio. Our producer is Jay Holt.